A black woman boards a first-class cabin on a transatlantic flight. She's calm, composed, and quiet. But then, a flight attendant glares at her seat and says the words no passenger ever forgets. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but are you sure you can afford this?" What happened next stunned the entire crew. Why was she so calm? Even as others stared, why didn't she raise her voice? And who exactly was this woman in seat 1A within minutes? One decision would bring the entire flight and its assumptions to a halt. Oh, by the time they landed, the headlines had already begun to spread. But what the world didn't know was that this wasn't just a viral moment. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Who was she really? And how did her quiet strength end up changing an entire airline from the inside out? This story is not just about one flight. It's about every time someone has been underestimated, overlooked, or told they didn't belong. So if you're ready for a journey of power, pain, and poetic justice, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. Let's begin. The hum of the aircraft was almost meditative, soft and rhythmic like the tide. It filled the first-class cabin with a low, comforting presence as passengers boarded North Star Flight NS-214 from Boston to Oslo. There was a kind of elegant hush in this part of the plane, a sanctuary of sculpted leather, warm ambient lighting, and barely audible classical music filtering through overhead speakers. Dr. Nadine Langford sat quietly in seat 1A, sipping plain water from a glass tumbler. She wore a stone-gray travel blazer over a cream silk blouse, her only adornment a slim platinum watch and a pair of understated pearl studs. Her skin was deep and smooth, her hair braided and tucked neatly behind her shoulders. She appeared composed, settled, but if you looked closer, there was a quiet fire behind her eyes. Not defiance, not arrogance, something older, something earned. She had boarded early, as was her preference, with nothing but a small leather carry-on and a graphite tablet she was now reviewing. On the screen were aerospace reports, fuel efficiency metrics, updated crew feedback logs, and a few notes marked in her own hand. But every so often, her gaze drifted away from the words and toward the cabin entrance, not because she was waiting for someone, but because she had learned through years of boardrooms, break rooms, and briefings to stay aware, to watch how people reacted to her presence, to measure assumptions before they arrived at her doorstep. The cabin door swung open again as another pair of heels clicked down the aisle. The boarding process was quiet, smooth. Nadine loved this time, before the chaos, when the world hadn't yet asked anything of her. She let out a long, invisible breath and took another sip of water. A soft, confident voice approached. "Welcome aboard, ma'am. May I offer you a glass of champagne before takeoff?" Nadine looked up to see a young man, early 20s perhaps, in a crisp North Star uniform. His name tag read Luis. His expression was warm, earnest. "Thank you, Louis," she said, smiling gently. "But just water is perfect for now." "Of course," he replied. "Let me know if you need anything at all." He moved with a kind of nervous energy that said he was still new to the job, but trying his best. That mattered to her. So few people tried any more. From the galley just ahead, another figure emerged, older, brisker, less warm. The woman's movements were sharp, efficient, polished to perfection. Her blonde bob barely moved as she walked. She scanned the cabin with the quiet command of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she was the senior purser for the flight. Clara glanced briefly at Luis, then let her eyes roam over the passengers beginning to settle into their pods. She nodded politely to a suited man in 2C, offered a smile to the older couple arranging their reading glasses in 3D and 3F. But when her gaze landed on Nadine Langford in seat 1A, something shifted. Clara's face didn't change. Not exactly. But her shoulders stiffened. Her expression cooled. She took a half step forward, as if making sure she had seen correctly. A black woman, alone, in seat 1A. Clara made a note of it, the way one might note a malfunctioning coffee maker or a tray table that wouldn't latch. Not a threat, just something out of place. Nadine felt it instantly, that brief flicker in the air, the change in temperature that always seemed to follow her into elite spaces. She said nothing. She kept reading. Clara turned without a word and moved toward the galley. Luis was still preparing drinks, setting silver trays in place with care. She leaned in. "Who's in 1A?" Clara asked. Her tone clipped. Luis blinked. "Passenger's name is Dr. Langford. I believe she boarded early." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Doctor? Huh. Did she say what kind?" Luis shook his head. "No, ma'am. But she was polite. Quiet. Didn't ask for anything." Clara didn't respond immediately. Then she muttered, "Keep an eye. Sometimes these upgrades slip through." Luis's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "Of course." As she walked away, Luis turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of Dr. Langford adjusting her seat control and returning to her reading. Something about the exchange bothered him. Back in 1A, Nadine was aware of everything. The glances, the energy, the sudden recalculations people made when her appearance didn't match their expectations. At 56, she had long since stopped expecting fairness, but she still hoped, sometimes, for basic courtesy. It was not the first time she had been seen as the exception.
The one black woman in a boardroom at a summit, on a private call with global investors. They never said it aloud. They didn't have to. It was there and how long it took them to look her in the eye. How they praised her eloquence as if surprised by it. How they asked if she needed help finding the meeting room when she was the one chairing it. So when Clara passed her seat a second time, this time without even a nod, Nadine knew exactly what she was being asked to prove without a single word spoken. She straightened her posture just slightly and locked her tablet. Let them wonder. She had built engines that powered cross-continental jets. She had walked away from companies that begged her to stay. She had survived cancer. She had survived sexism, racism, backhanded compliments, and strategic silences. She would survive this flight, too. But she was growing tired of surviving, and she had not flown commercial today by coincidence. She had come to observe, quietly, as she often did, to ensure North Star's service standards remained intact. She had once told the CEO, Caleb Trenton, "You can't fix what you won't sit through." So she sat, she watched, she listened. Today, it seemed, she might need to do more than that. As the last of the passengers boarded, Clara's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard North Star Flight NS-214 to Oslo. Our estimated flight time today is 6 hours and 52 minutes. Nadine closed her eyes and exhaled. "Let's begin." The seatbelt light pinged softly, casting a gentle glow over the plush cabin. Dr. Nadine Langford kept her gaze steady out the window, watching the tarmac crawl by as the aircraft was pushed back from the gate. There was something about this moment, the slow taxi, the final preparations before takeoff, that always made her quiet. It wasn't fear. She trusted the machines. After all, she had helped design their hearts. No, it was the stillness before momentum, the ritual before motion. She valued rituals. Luis Moreno passed by with final checks.
offering a quick smile as he confirmed her seatbelt was fastened. She nodded back, appreciative. Then came Clara Whitmore, gliding past like a headmistress in a corridor. She didn't look at Nadine, not directly. Her presence felt like a cold draft where none should exist. Nadine closed her eyes and let the subtle weight of gravity press her into her seat as the plane accelerated. The roar of the engines grew, then softened into a hum as the wheels left Earth. It was a moment of surrender, of trust in physics and metal and human hands. As they reached cruising altitude, the cabin lights adjusted to a warmer tone. Louis returned, this time with a basket of warm towels. He handed one to Nadine with a practiced ease and a gentle, "Here you go, Dr. Langford." "Thank you," she replied softly, meeting his eyes with quiet gratitude. Clara wasn't far behind. She was moving methodically down the aisle, pausing here and there to ask passengers if they needed anything. But when she reached seat 1A, her manner changed. Her voice lost its softness. Her eyes avoided direct contact. "Ma'am," she said, stopping at Nadine's side, "I'll need to verify your boarding pass again." The request came so flatly, so casually, it almost didn't register. Nadine blinked, setting down her towel on the tray. "I'm sorry," Clara cleared her throat, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. "Just for verification, if you could show me your boarding pass again." Nadine stared at her for a long beat. The plane had already been in the air for nearly 20 minutes. Her boarding pass had been scanned, her seat settled, her drink served. There was no precedent, no policy that would explain such a request now. She reached for her carry-on calmly, retrieved the paper slip, and handed it to Clara without a word. Clara examined it longer than necessary. Her eyes darted from the name to the seat to the barcode. She turned it over as if it might reveal some hidden truth. Then she handed it back with a forced smile. "All set," she muttered, and turned quickly toward the next row. Nadine tucked the slip away, her movements measured. She didn't sigh. She didn't frown. But she felt it again. That familiar rustle of insult dressed as routine. She didn't imagine it. She never had to. Luis had seen it too. He was standing just a few rows behind, assisting an elderly woman with her overhead bin. But his eyes followed Clara's retreating figure, then flicked back to Nadine. There was hesitation in his expression, a flicker of concern he couldn't quite hide. Later, as the meal service began, Luis approached again. "I'm so sorry for the interruption earlier," he said in a low voice. "I believe everything's been verified already." Nadine offered a small, tired smile. "It has, but thank you." She didn't ask anyone else for their pass again, Luis added, before stopping himself. I just wanted to acknowledge it. That mattered to her, more than she could say. As he moved down the aisle, Nadine leaned back in her seat, letting the silence settle over her. But silence didn't mean peace. Her mind was turning, memories resurfacing like driftwood in a tide. She remembered being 26 and presenting her first design for a fuel-efficient turbine blade to a room full of middle-aged men who never looked her in the eye. She remembered the VP who called her sweetheart during a negotiation for a government contract. She remembered when she was addressed as Mrs. Langford, even after signing documents as Dr. Nadine Langford, Ph.D., and now, here she was again, in a pod she had personally helped design, on an aircraft her company had funded, flying under a brand she owned a controlling stake in. And yet, all it took was one glance, one snap judgment for someone to question whether she belonged. The worst part wasn't the act. It was the ritual of it, the frequency, the constancy. The repetition had carved a groove into her spirit, one she had learned to walk along like a well-worn path. She looked down at her hands, steady, strong, calloused from decades of pushing past resistance. They didn't tremble, but inside, something stirred. She wasn't angry, not yet. What she felt was the sorrow of being forced to carry herself like evidence. For so much of her life, she had existed in rooms where her presence needed justification. Her degrees weren't enough. Her titles weren't enough. Her voice, her resume, her patents, her board seat. None of it ever truly canceled out the moment someone saw her and decided she couldn't possibly belong. Sometimes she wished she could be invisible, just for 1 hour, to sit in a space and simply be undoubted. She turned her head and looked at the white man in 2C across the aisle. He was drinking wine, reading the Financial Times, completely undisturbed. No one had asked him to verify anything. No one ever would. But she didn't envy him. She envied the simplicity of his journey. Across the cabin, Clara continued serving drinks with professional polish. Her smile returned when speaking to the hedge fund manager in 3A. She knelt slightly to assist the woman with the designer purse in 2D. There was a gentleness to her now, one that had been noticeably absent when she stood in front of 1A. Nadine saw it for what it was, a performance of warmth, a choreography rehearsed for those who looked the part. Her seat wasn't just a number, it was a trigger. Seat 1A wasn't supposed to belong to someone like her. She folded her hands gently in her lap. She wasn't ready to act. Not yet. There was still the possibility that this would end here, that Clara would leave her alone, that the imbalance would pass quietly into the shadows like so many others. But she also knew what came next. The subtle provocations, the justifications wrapped in policy, the escalation masked as concern. She had seen the pattern before, and she was beginning to suspect she'd see it again. Dinner service hadn't yet begun, but the scent of roasted garlic and warm bread already drifted through the first-class cabin. Nadine Langford tried to focus on her tablet, scrolling through crew reports and updated timelines for the new composite wing prototypes. But her concentration came in short bursts, scattered by the memory of Clara Whitmore's tone and the awkward way she had requested her boarding pass again. It wasn't the kind of confrontation that made headlines. It was the smaller cuts that left the deeper bruises. There had been no shouting, no slurs, just a tone, a question asked when it didn't need to be, a glance held a second too long. Nadine's hands were still, her face unreadable. But inside, something had begun to tilt. She hadn't come on this flight expecting to be recognized. That was the point. She did this twice a quarter, unannounced, unbranded. She left the luxury suites, the executive lounges, the red carpet welcomes behind and boarded as any other passenger. It was her personal system check. If her company's values weren't reflected in the air, then what were they worth? She didn't want special treatment. But she had never anticipated being challenged for daring to exist in a space she had built with her own hands. A few rows behind her, Luis Moreno continued his duties with quiet diligence. He served water to a couple who giggled over their honeymoon plans. He helped a businessman retrieve a dropped cufflink with a smile. But his eyes kept drifting back to 1A. Luis wasn't new to seeing odd dynamics on flights. He had been trained to handle everything from minor irritations to full-blown emergencies. But this situation sat differently. It wasn't what Clara had said. It was how she had said it, and how quickly she had cooled the air around seat 1A. He had heard stories from other crew members, whispers about Clara's rigidity, her tendency to be extra vigilant with certain passengers. It had always sounded like gossip before. Now it sounded like warning. As he returned to the galley to check the dinner trays, Clara swept in behind him like a tide. "Luis," she said, her voice neutral, "I noticed you've been hovering around 1A quite a bit." Luis straightened, caught off guard. "Just providing service, ma'am." Her smile was thin. "Of course. Just remember, we have 16 passengers in this cabin. Let's not let one dominate our attention. I'm sure you weren't. Just keep it even." With that, she turned and exited back into the aisle, leaving Luis with a tight jaw and a chest full of unspoken words. In seat 1A. Nadine looked up just as Clara passed by again. There was no eye contact, no greeting, just presence, purposeful and pointed. This time, Nadine did sigh, a soft breath, barely audible, but it said everything. She had hoped it would pass, that Clara would find something else to focus on. But this woman had made up her mind. Nadine was a variable, an anomaly, and Clara needed an explanation to make her world feel orderly again. Nadine's fingers curled gently around the edge of her tablet. She reminded herself that she had survived worse. Much worse. But she wasn't 28 anymore. She wasn't proving herself in the trenches of academic engineering or battling microaggressions in Silicon Valley boardrooms. She had built something now. She owned something. Not just the stock, the soul of the company. And still, she was being treated like an intruder. She thought of her mother, a quiet school teacher who always dressed a little too formally for parent-teacher nights because she said you never know who's judging. Her mother had taught her that excellence was armor, that dignity could be defiance. Nadine had believed that for decades, but sometimes even armor grew heavy. She looked down at her lap, at the perfectly tailored lines of her slacks and the quiet elegance of her travel blazer. It wasn't just clothes. It was a language, a signal, a strategy. It always had been. Every detail of how she presented herself was calculated, controlled. She had learned that in order to be taken seriously, she had to show up flawless. Always. And still, it didn't protect her from someone like Clara. Her tablet chimed gently. An incoming message from Caleb Trenton, the CEO of North Star Holdings. Just one line. "Let me know how it feels from 1A this quarter." She stared at the message for a long moment. It felt exhausting. She thought. It felt like watching someone point a flashlight in your face and insist they're just doing their job. She didn't reply. Not yet. Clara returned again, this time with a silver tray of mixed nuts for the front row. "Mr. Dawson," she said brightly to the man in 1C, placing a napkin with care. "Would you like some of our smoked almonds?" "Yes, please," the man replied with a slight nod. "And for you, ma'am." She turned to Nadine, but this time there was no tray, no napkin, just the question. Nadine raised an eyebrow. "I believe I was skipped." Clara blinked. "Oh, must have missed your side. I'll be right back." She returned with the tray, but didn't offer a napkin, just a single paper towel hastily folded. "Thank you," Nadine said, her voice calm but firm. "You're welcome," Clara replied, quickly turning away. Luis watched the entire exchange from the galley entrance. He felt it again, the tightening in his chest. He had read about unconscious bias during his training, watched the required diversity videos, clicked through the compliance modules. But this wasn't unconscious. This was practiced. He didn't know who Dr. Langford was, but he knew she deserved better than this. He looked around the cabin. Every other passenger was being served with rehearsed warmth, except 1A. The contrast was loud, even in silence. Nadine returned to her tablet. But she wasn't reading anymore. She was remembering the first time she had flown with North Star, years before she joined the board. Back then, it had been a struggling regional carrier with aging planes and a revolving door of leadership. She had seen potential buried under layers of inefficiency. She'd invested, slowly at first, then all in. She had spent years shaping the company into what it was now. She had rewritten service protocols, redesigned cabin interiors, championed fuel innovation. She had even authored the internal charter on passenger dignity. And now, that charter was being mocked quietly by one of her own senior staff. She felt a flicker of something hot in her chest. Not rage, something colder, like resolve crystallizing. Clara returned one last time with the menus. "For dinner," she said, handing them out, "we're offering pan-seared halibut or filet mignon. The chef recommends the filet." Nadine accepted the menu silently. She wasn't hungry anymore, but she knew she would order the filet. Not because of taste, because Clara would hate it, and because something told her that this flight was far from over. Dinner service began with the gentle rustle of menus closing and silverware being unwrapped. Across the first-class cabin, wine glasses were topped off, and linen napkins spread across laps like ritual. The hum of the engine softened into a lull that lulled most passengers into relaxed conversation or quiet anticipation. But not Nadine Langford. She had chosen the filet. It sat untouched in front of her now, perfectly plated with roasted root vegetables and a dark wine reduction. It smelled incredible. But Nadine didn't pick up her fork. Her appetite had vanished beneath the weight of tension that had slowly draped itself over her shoulders. Clara Whitmore had not returned since delivering the entree. Not with fresh bread, not with wine, not even a glance to confirm satisfaction. It was as if seat 1A no longer existed. Except it did. And Clara couldn't help herself. Luis Moreno had noticed it too. While circulating the cabin, he caught glimpses of Clara's glances toward Nadine, brief, clinical, as if studying an unpredictable variable. It made him anxious. He had only been flying with North Star for 9 months, and already he understood which lines not to cross. But this felt like a line someone else had stepped over, dragging him with them. He had asked Clara gently earlier if he could take over first-class dessert service. She'd declined, saying, "I'll handle 1A myself." He couldn't tell if it was punishment or pride. He glanced again at Nadine, who sat with such stillness it was almost unnerving. She looked out the window now, eyes unfocused, lips pressed together. She looked like someone calculating something far more complicated than dinner service. Inside, Nadine's thoughts pulsed in slow, deliberate circles. She was holding back. That, in itself, was exhausting. She had learned to do it all her life. Bite back the sharp reply. Swallow the insult whole. Compose herself because the world expected her to be both model and martyr. But the cost was adding up, and she was tired of footing the bill. She had not come on this flight to be the center of a teachable moment, but Clara was pushing her toward a choice. Speak up, or let it slide one more time. The problem was, there had been too many slides already, and she wasn't here as a guest. She was here as a witness to her own system, and her system was failing. A familiar voice pulled her back to the moment. "Everything okay with your meal, ma'am?" It was Luis, appearing beside her with a nervous but genuine expression. Nadine looked up. the corners of her mouth lifting just slightly. "Yes. Thank you. Luis?" He hesitated, then leaned in a little closer, his voice barely audible. "If there's anything you need, I'm right here." She nodded. "I appreciate that. It wasn't much, but it meant something. A small ember of decency in a space that had begun to feel colder by the hour." Clara appeared again shortly after, her tray held like a shield. "Would you like dessert?" she asked, her tone brisk. "Options tonight are creme brulee or the seasonal fruit." Nadine tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll take the creme brulee," she said evenly. Clara paused. "I'll need to see your boarding pass again." The words landed like ice water on a warm plate. Around them, conversation dimmed. The man in one seat turned his head slightly. The older couple across the aisle stopped whispering. Luis, standing a few feet away, froze. Nadine's hand rested on her lap, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her trousers. "That won't be necessary," she replied, voice low, steady. "I'm afraid it is," Clara said. "We have to verify eligibility for certain selections in this cabin." Nadine stared at her, unblinking. "I'm in seat 1A. I've already been served the main course. There's nothing left to verify." "It's standard protocol," Clara said, her voice rising slightly. "Sometimes people book economy and are moved here due to overflows or internal error. We've had fraud before." Nadine's jaw tightened, but her tone remained soft. "Let me be clear. You've checked my boarding pass twice already. You offered me no napkin. You have hovered, interrogated, and now you are questioning whether I'm entitled to a ramekin of custard. Is that correct?" Clara looked around quickly, clearly aware that all eyes were now on them. "I'm just doing my job," she said through her teeth. "No," Nadine said, still calm. "You're abusing your job, and you're doing it selectively." At that, Clara drew herself up. "There's no need to be hostile," she said, her voice sharper now. "If you cannot produce your documentation, I will need to escalate this." Luis stepped forward instinctively. "Miss Whitmore." "Stay out of this," Clara snapped at him, her hand raised. Luis's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Nadine, apologetic, helpless. Nadine turned her eyes to Clara. Something inside her clicked into place, a line crossing silently in her soul. She had tried. She had endured. She had given this woman space to self-correct. But now the moment had arrived. Nadine placed her napkin carefully on her tray. She rose slowly, deliberately. At 5'9", she was not imposing by stature, but her presence expanded as she stood, as if the air itself made room for her. "Miss Whitmore," she began, her voice so quiet it made the silence louder. "You are dangerously close to making a career-defining mistake." Clara blinked. "Excuse me. You want documentation. You want proof. You want to understand who I am and what I'm doing in this seat." She took a small step closer. "You are not just questioning a passenger. You are questioning a woman who has poured 20 years of her life into the very wings holding this aircraft above the ocean. You are standing inside a cabin I helped design. You are addressing the majority shareholder of this airline." The silence was absolute. Even the hum of the plane seemed to still itself. Luis looked stunned. The man in 1C dropped his fork. Clara stared, her face pale. "You're lying." "I am not," Nadine replied. "You're not on any executive list." "I would know." "You wouldn't," Nadine said calmly, "because I travel anonymously. I do this to observe, to learn, to ensure our values are reflected in every seat. But today, you've reminded me why it's not enough to observe quietly anymore." Clara took a step back, faltering. Luis's voice cut in gently. "Ma'am, is there anything I can do?" "Yes," Nadine said, eyes still locked on Clara. "Please notify Captain Everett that I've invoked Directive Polaris. Tell him it is not an emergency, but that his presence is required immediately." Luis blinked. He had only heard of Polaris in training. He didn't think it was real. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, and hurried toward the cockpit. Nadine sat back down, folded her hands, and waited. Clara stood frozen, lips parted, confusion and disbelief etched into every line of her face. The moment had shifted. The cabin could feel it. And somewhere over the Atlantic, the sky itself seemed to tilt in Nadine Langford's direction. Clara Whitmore stood frozen in the aisle, the hum of the aircraft vibrating faintly beneath her polished shoes. She stared at Nadine Langford as if the woman had just spoken a foreign language. It didn't compute. It didn't make sense. People didn't talk to her that way. Certainly not passengers. Certainly not black women in first class. She tried to summon a response, but no words came. Her grip tightened on the tray she still held, the silver edge digging into her palm. Luis Moreno had already disappeared toward the cockpit, his heart thundering in his chest. He replayed what Nadine had just said as he walked Directive Polaris. He had heard the phrase only once, in a training module buried deep in North Star's onboarding system. It was described as a rarely used protocol that allowed ownership-level figures to override operations in real time. Most flight attendants thought it was a myth. Luis had thought so too. Until now. In the first-class cabin, a tense silence lingered. Passengers shifted in their seats, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. The older man in 2C took off his glasses and slowly wiped them, not because they were dirty, but because it gave him something to do. Clara snapped back to life, as if shaking off an invisible fog. "This is absurd," she muttered under her breath. "Completely inappropriate." Nadine didn't respond. She sat still in seat 1A, her posture relaxed but deliberate, her eyes steady. There was no gloating in her expression, no vindication, only the steady resolve of someone who had been tested too many times. Clara looked around, scanning for an ally, someone to affirm that this was nonsense, that the woman in 1A was making an impossible claim, but no one met her gaze. The curtain to the cockpit rustled, and Captain Miles Everett emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp silver crew cut and a voice that carried authority even when it was quiet. He walked toward them calmly, eyes moving between the two women as he approached. "Good evening," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've been informed that Directive Polaris has been invoked by the passenger in seat 1A. Clara turned to him, her relief immediate and overflowing. "Captain, thank God. This passenger has been disruptive and non-compliant. She refused to produce documentation, accused me of harassment, and is now claiming to own the airline. I believe she may be unstable." Captain Everett said nothing at first. He turned toward Nadine. "Ma'am, may I ask your name again?" Nadine nodded once. "Dr. Nadine Langford." The captain's brow furrowed slightly, recognition flickering behind his eyes. He didn't know the name personally, but it sounded familiar, important. "I'm going to need to see your credentials for verification," he said respectfully. "Please understand, I'm following protocol." "Of course," Nadine replied. She retrieved her phone from the small compartment by her seat, unlocked it, and handed it to him. On the screen was an internal North Star document, marked confidential, with her name and ownership code. Below it was an email thread with the subject line, Polaris Activation Authority Clearance. The captain scanned the phone. Slowly, carefully. His face changed as he read. Clara stepped forward. "She's bluffing. Captain, she's making all of this up." Captain Everett held up a hand, silencing her. He looked at Nadine again, and this time he gave a slight nod. "Understood." He handed the phone back to her, then stepped aside and reached into the interior breast pocket of his jacket. From it, he retrieved a small black SATCOM handset, the kind reserved for secure in-flight communication. "I'll be contacting Mr. Caleb Trenton directly," he said, "per Polaris protocol." Clara's mouth dropped open. "You can't be serious." "I am," he said. "This isn't a judgment call. It's policy. And if Dr. Langford is who she says she is, and this has escalated as she described, we need confirmation from the top." Clara scoffed. "She's manipulating you." "No," Nadine said quietly. "I gave you every chance to avoid this." Captain Everett turned and walked back to the cockpit with the phone in hand. Clara stood rooted in place, her skin growing pale. Luis returned moments later, pausing at the edge of the curtain. He looked at Nadine, then at Clara, then at the other passengers who were watching everything with quiet intensity. Elliot Crane, seated in 2D, leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said toward Nadine, "if I may." She turned toward him, brows raised. "I'm a partner at Crane & Lovell," he said, "international law firm. I've been observing what's occurred here since boarding. I would be happy to provide a written statement on your behalf if needed." Nadine inclined her head. "Thank you. Mr. Crane." Clara looked like she'd been slapped. "This is a conspiracy," she said under her breath. "You're all in on something." Louis stepped forward. "Clara, maybe we should just wait for the captain. I don't need your advice." Clara snapped. "I'm the purser. You're here to refill glasses." Louis took a small step back. His face flushed with embarrassment. He looked at Nadine, who gave him a nod of calm reassurance. Then the cockpit door opened again. Captain Everett emerged, his face a shade paler than before. He walked directly to Nadine and held out the SATCOM phone like a sacred object. "Dr. Langford," he said, voice steady. "Mr. Trenton would like to speak with you personally." She took the phone, placed it gently to her ear. "Caleb," she said. "Dr. Langford." His voice came through, slightly distorted by the transmission. "I am so sorry. I just got the call from the captain." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Not angry, just disappointed. Say the word and I'll meet you in Oslo. Do we need to divert the flight?" "No," she said. "It's contained. But when I land, there will be a full report. This isn't just a personnel issue. It's cultural rot. Understood? You want full review? Yes? And I'll write the formal recommendation myself. Consider it done. I'll coordinate with HR and ethics by the time you land. Thank you. Caleb, whatever you need." She ended the call and handed the phone back to the captain. Clara was trembling now. "You can't. I mean, this is still under investigation. There hasn't been any. You are no longer in charge of this cabin," Nadine said, standing again. Her voice wasn't raised. "It didn't need to be. As of this moment, I'm relieving you of all duties related to passenger interaction. You will remain in the crew rest area for the duration of the flight. You will not speak to staff or passengers unless there is a safety emergency." Clara's mouth opened, but no words came. Captain Everett turned to Luis. Mr. Moreno, you are the acting purser for the remainder of the flight. Please take over duties for first-class cabin." Luis nodded slowly. "Yes, Captain." The captain turned to Clara. "Come with me." Clara looked at the other passengers. No one came to her defense. No one offered sympathy. She looked like a woman who had walked into a mirror and realized the reflection wasn't what she expected. As she disappeared behind the curtain, the air shifted again. Elliot Crane leaned back in his seat. Luis stepped to the galley to catch his breath. Nadine sat down. Her heart beat evenly. Her hands folded. It was quiet again, but not the same quiet. It was the silence that comes after a storm has passed through and left nothing standing. The curtain rustled faintly behind Nadine Langford as it fell back into place. Separating first class from the galley and the path Clara Whitmore had just disappeared down. For the first time since takeoff, the cabin felt still, not because the tension had lifted, but because the moment of confrontation had passed. What remained was aftermath. Silence. Shock. Reflection. Luis Moreno stood near the galley, hands lightly trembling. He had never expected anything like this when he joined North Star. In his training, they had discussed everything from turbulence protocols to de-escalation strategies. But nothing could have prepared him for the weight of what had just unfolded. He had witnessed prejudice, entitlement, and injustice. But he had also witnessed grace, strength, and the quiet detonation of truth. He walked toward seat 1A slowly, carefully, unsure if he was intruding. "Dr. Langford," he said softly, stopping just beside her. "Would you like me to bring your dessert now?" Nadine looked up at him. There was warmth in her expression, a calmness that surprised even her. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She gave a small nod. "Yes, Luis. Thank you. And please," she added, "don't feel the need to tiptoe around me. I'm not fragile. I just needed today to happen." He nodded once, his throat tight. "Of course, ma'am." He disappeared into the galley. Nadine turned back toward the window. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic stretched in every direction, blank and vast, holding the sun's last light in shimmering slivers. She let herself breathe, deeply this time, not as armor, but as release. A soft voice came from behind. "Excuse me, Dr. Langford." It was the man from seat 2D, Elliot Crane. He had stood quietly after Clara was led away and now approached with a mixture of hesitation and respect. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what you had to go through." Nadine met his eyes. "You didn't do it." "No, but I watched it, and I didn't speak up until it was safe. That's not nothing, but it's not enough either." She studied him for a moment. There was no performance in his tone, just honesty, and maybe a bit of shame. "You did speak," she said gently. "Most don't." He gave a sad smile. "Still, if there's anything I can do to support a formal investigation, I'm happy to provide written testimony." "I'd appreciate that," Nadine said. "But more than that, I appreciate your decency." He extended a hand. She shook it firmly. Then he returned to his seat. Luis reappeared with the crème brûlée, his hand steadier now. He placed it on her tray with care and set down a folded linen napkin, replacing the paper towel Clara had offered earlier. Nadine noticed. "Thank you," she said again. He hesitated. "Dr. Langford, I don't mean to overstep, but how do you do it?" She tilted her head. "Do it stay so calm? I would have lost it." Nadine looked at the untouched dessert. Her voice, when it came, was soft. Because I've been losing it slowly for 30 years. If I screamed every time I was dismissed, belittled, or doubted, I wouldn't have any voice left. Louis nodded slowly. But that wasn't just doubt. That was. He trailed off, searching for the word. Racism, Nadine finished for him. Call it what it is. He swallowed hard. Yes, that. She looked up at him again. And that's why I didn't lose my temper. Because people like Clara expect me to. They want to provoke a reaction they can weaponize. One outburst, one raised voice, and suddenly I become the problem. I knew what she was doing. I've seen it before. Louise leaned against the service panel, taking a breath. I didn't know what to do. You did enough, Nadine said gently. You saw. You cared. And when it counted, you did the right thing. A chime from the intercom interrupted the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, came Captain Everett's voice. This is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 36,000 feet and making excellent time. Estimated arrival in Oslo is 7:05 a.m. local time. We'd like to thank you again for choosing North Star. Enjoy the rest of your flight. The message ended with a soft click. Nadine smiled faintly. She could almost hear the captain's underlying tone. It was no longer routine. He had just witnessed a rupture in the hierarchy he had likely never questioned before. And now he was on the other side of it. She picked up her spoon and cracked the surface of the crème brûlée with a quiet snap. The custard beneath was smooth, perfectly chilled. She took a bite and let the sweetness melt across her tongue. A small indulgence, a small victory. The cabin remained hushed. No one wanted to be the first to return to normal conversation. Every passenger had witnessed something that would stay with them longer than the flight. A few glanced at Nadine from behind their screens or books. Not with suspicion, not anymore, with something closer to recognition. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer silent. Later, as the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers began to doze off, Louise returned with a warm blanket and placed it gently across her lap. "Let me know if you need anything else," he whispered. She nodded, resting her head back. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself to relax. Clara Whitmore, somewhere in the crew rest area, would not be sleeping so soundly. The humiliation had been public, but the true reckoning was still coming. Nadine knew what it would look like. She had written policies for it. Clara would be interviewed. Statements would be collected. The flight data recorder would include her actions and words. The emails would be reviewed. And then she would be gone. It wasn't vengeance. It was consequence. And Nadine hadn't needed to raise her voice to make it happen. She thought of her mother again, of the way she used to say, "You can tell the difference between thunder and lightning, but both mean a storm is coming." Nadine had been the lightning today, quiet, precise, unmistakable. She glanced toward the cockpit and made a mental note to call Caleb Trenton again after landing. There would be much to discuss. Clara's removal was only the beginning. This wasn't about one bad employee. This was about culture. This was about every flight where someone like her was made to feel small, doubted, questioned, erased. That era was over, and she would be the one to make sure of it. She turned off her reading light, closed her eyes, and let the aircraft carry her forward, toward morning, toward justice. The cabin lights remained low, casting a soft amber glow over the slumbering passengers of Flight NS-214. Somewhere outside the sealed windows, the edge of dawn began to gather just beyond the horizon, a faint line of silver brushing against the stars. They were over the Norwegian Sea now, a few hours from Oslo. The aircraft cruised with calm steadiness. But inside the first-class cabin, something else had begun to shift, something invisible but irreversible. Dr. Nadine Langford opened her eyes slowly. She hadn't really slept. Her body had rested, but her mind had kept moving, reviewing every detail of the incident, the interrogation over a dessert, the disbelief in Clara's face. The moment she invoked Directive Polaris, it played again in her head like a loop, only this time without the sting. The moment didn't haunt her, it clarified her. She sat up and reached for her water glass. Luis must have refilled it during the night. There was something deeply human in the way he moved through the cabin. Not just polite, but intentional, present. She made a mental note to flag him for commendation, not just for how he had handled the tension, but for how he had cared. She reached for her tablet and began typing quietly. No bold gestures, no CEO press statement, just her private log of the flight. She had done this for years, archiving experiences and observations from each quarterly check-in. This one would be the longest yet. A few rows behind her, Luis sat briefly in the jump seat, sipping lukewarm tea and glancing toward 1A now and then. He felt like he had stepped into someone else's story. No, he had stepped into someone's legacy. One built in silence, bricks laid in decades of excellence, only to be questioned with a glance. He shook his head and rubbed his eyes. From the crew rest area, Clara hadn't moved. She had refused food, declined conversation. Her arms crossed tightly, back against the wall, eyes unfocused. Even the junior attendants avoided her now, unsure what to say. The Clara they had known, the rigid but respected purser, was no longer in control. She wasn't even a figure of authority anymore. She was simply suspended, and she knew it. Captain Everett returned to the cabin briefly around hour 6, stopping by 1A and crouching down beside Nadine's seat. "I wanted to say thank you," he said quietly, "for what she asked, for handling the situation the way you did, with clarity and restraint." Nadine gave a tired smile. "Restraint is a muscle I've developed over time." He looked down for a moment, thoughtful. "I've flown with Clara for years. I never saw that side of her. Or maybe I did, and I didn't let myself register it." "You probably did," Nadine replied gently. "Most people do, but it's easier to believe that what you're seeing is harmless. We all create narratives to protect our assumptions." He nodded slowly. "This has been a wake-up call." "Good," she said. "But don't let it just be a personal lesson. Make sure it echoes. Quiet bigotry survives because it's rarely named out loud." The captain looked visibly moved. "When we land, I'll meet with Caleb. If you're convening a formal review, I want to participate. You'll be hearing from me," she said. He stood, gave her a slight bow of respect, and returned to the cockpit. The truth was, Nadine had been fighting this fight longer than most of the crew had been working, and she had learned over time that public dignity didn't mean private silence. You could be composed and still disrupt the system. You could be soft-spoken and still turn the entire plane toward truth. The final hours of the flight passed in relative calm. Elliot Crane woke up, checked his phone, and sent an email to his legal assistant requesting a time block for a sworn affidavit. He glanced toward Nadine once before returning to his notes. Passengers in nearby rows had shifted in their perception of her. Some now offered soft smiles when passing to the restroom. Others simply nodded in quiet acknowledgement. It wasn't hero worship. It was something deeper. Recognition. At last. The chime rang, and the captain's voice returned to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Oslo shortly." Please return your seats to the upright position and secure all tray tables. The local temperature is 42 degrees Fahrenheit with clear skies. We'll be arriving a few minutes ahead of schedule. Thank you for flying North Star." The crew moved efficiently through the cabin. Luis approached 1A with a fresh towel and a refill of still water. "Final descent. Dr. Langford." "Thank you," she said, folding the towel across her tray. He hesitated for a second, then added, "It's been an honor flying with you." She looked at him carefully. "You have a future in this airline. Luis, hold on to your empathy. The world will try to burn it out of you. Don't let it." He nodded once, as if sealing a promise. As the aircraft descended, the city of Oslo began to emerge through the clouds, bridges stretching over icy waters, roads like ribbons between the hills. The light had shifted completely now, golden and strong. Morning had arrived. The landing was smooth. When the aircraft taxied to the gate, a small group of people waited beyond the glass. Among them, Nadine spotted a familiar figure. Caleb Trenton, standing beside two women from HR and a man from corporate compliance. She raised an eyebrow. They had arrived early. As the cabin door opened and the passengers began to disembark, the first-class section remained still. Caleb stepped on board before anyone else and moved directly to 1A. "Dr. Langford," he said, offering his hand. "Mr. Trenton," she replied, shaking it. "Would you be willing to debrief briefly in the jet bridge? We've secured a private area. The others can wait." She rose with quiet purpose. "Let's make it quick." Louis opened the curtain and stepped aside. Nadine walked past him with a slight smile, and then down the narrow aisle, where every crew member now stood at attention. Clara Whitmore was not among them. In the jet bridge, the mood was colder. Caleb gestured toward a private seating area near the gate. Nadine sat. A file folder sat waiting. She opened it. The first page was Clara Whitmore's personnel record. The second, a printed version of the complaint statement. The third, a review of previous minor incidents that had been dismissed as miscommunications. Nadine scanned it all with the speed of someone who had read hundreds of similar files. When she looked up, her voice was calm. "Terminate her," she said. "But that's not enough." Caleb nodded. "We're launching an audit of the entire cabin crew division. We'll be reviewing every cultural bias report from the last 5 years. We'll also make your Polaris protocol more visible." "Good," Nadine said. "Now I want you to greenlight Project Nightingale. No more delays." His eyebrows lifted. "The training initiative." "Not just training," Nadine said. "It's a values reset, ground-up re-education, not just for crew, for leadership, for marketing, for vendor relations. We are changing the soul of this airline." Caleb exhaled. "You're serious?" "I sign your paychecks." "Caleb," Nadine said, not unkindly, "I'm always serious." He gave a slight, almost embarrassed laugh. "Then it's done." She stood and extended a hand. "Thank you for meeting me with integrity. You met this moment with power." He said, "I met it with patience." Nadine replied, "Power came later." She turned toward the terminal and walked into the light of morning. Oslo's morning air hit Nadine Langford like a quiet reminder of everything she had carried with her across the ocean. It was crisp, sharp against her skin, but in a strange way it grounded her. She paused just outside the terminal, watching as the early sunlight spilled across the glass facade. Travelers moved around her with focused energy, pulling suitcases, tapping screens, calling taxis. No one recognized her. No one knew that just hours ago. 36,000 feet above the earth. She had cracked open the surface of something that had been rotting quietly for years. She wasn't thinking about Clara anymore. Clara was a symptom, a product of something more insidious, and now Nadine had the clarity and position to do something about it. Behind her, Caleb Trenton caught up, slightly out of breath. He wasn't the kind of executive who enjoyed early flights, but he had shown up. That mattered. "Nadine," he said, "we've arranged for a private vehicle. The rest of the review team is heading to headquarters." She nodded, but didn't move yet. "Before I get in that car, I want your word on something." He straightened. "Of course. I want full transparency on the audit. No names protected, no files redacted. If you're asking me to relaunch Project Nightingale, I need your backing. In writing. You'll have it," he said without hesitation. "We'll get the signed agreement over to you by noon." She turned then and began walking toward the car, pulling her blazer closed with one hand. Inside the vehicle, Nadine sat in silence while the driver navigated the clean, winding streets of Oslo. Her phone buzzed. Notifications rolling in, one after another, emails, internal messages, forwarded news clippings. One headline caught her attention. "Passenger incident on NS-214 sparks internal review at North Star Airways." It was already out. She clicked the article. It was vague, with no names and little context, but the comments section below was already alive with speculation. Some blamed the passenger, others the crew. A few, chillingly accurate, guessed what had really happened. She closed the screen. She hadn't planned to go public, but she knew now it might be necessary. Later that morning, Nadine arrived at North Star's Oslo satellite office, a clean, modern building just outside the city center. She was greeted with restrained reverence whispers, nods, a few double takes. Most employees didn't know what had transpired yet, but the ones who did were already bracing for the aftershocks. A conference room had been set aside for her. Inside were 3 people, a woman from HR named Layla Strum, a man from ethics named Jonah Wells, and the flight crew operations manager, Henrik Dahl. They stood as Nadine entered. "Dr. Langford," Layla said, extending a hand. "Thank you for meeting with us on such short notice. I assume you've all read my preliminary report," Nadine said, sliding a folder onto the table. "Yes," Jonah nodded. "We also have Luis Moreno's statement and corroborating notes from Captain Everett and a passenger witness." "Good," Nadine replied. "Now I want to know what you intend to do about it." There was a beat of hesitation. Henrik cleared his throat. "We've placed Clara Whitmore on immediate suspension pending termination review. Her prior incidents, though previously classified as minor, now show a pattern of discriminatory behavior when taken in full context." "That's a start," Nadine said. "But again, Clara's a symptom, not the disease." Jonah leaned forward. "We agree. That's why we're launching a wider internal audit. We're also ready to implement the training modules under Project Nightingale. We'd like you to help lead the curriculum design." Nadine looked at him steadily. "That's not enough. I want field simulations. I want anonymous evaluations. And I want mandatory rotating mentorships between junior and senior crew. It's time we broke the hierarchy that protects ignorance." Layla glanced down at her notes. "That's ambitious, but doable." "Good," Nadine said, "because we are no longer in the business of tolerating passive prejudice." Henrik looked slightly pale. "Dr. Langford, I hope you understand this may provoke resistance." Nadine smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Let them resist," she said. "Their discomfort is not my concern. After the meeting, Nadine returned to her temporary office. She removed her heels and sat quietly for a moment, letting her thoughts settle. She had kept it together all morning. She had delivered every line with precision. But something inside her still trembled, not with fear, but with memory. The humiliation of being asked to prove she belonged. The sour taste of having to name her own power just to be seen. She didn't cry. She rarely did. But she allowed herself a full breath, a slow exhale, a moment of sacred stillness. Her assistant, Mara Jensen, knocked lightly and entered. "Your son called earlier?" she said softly. "I told him you'd call back when you were ready." Nadine nodded. "Thank you, Mara." Mara paused before leaving. "And for what it's worth, I watched the incident. Someone leaked part of the cabin footage. It's already going viral. You were extraordinary." Nadine looked up, her face softening. "I wasn't trying to be." "I know," Mara said. "That's why it worked." She left, and Nadine turned to her phone. She stared at the screen for a long moment before finally pressing the call button. Her son picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Mom, you okay?" His voice was warm, gentle. It cut through her like a bomb. "I'm okay," she said. "Tired, but okay. I saw the clip. Some of my friends sent it to me, not realizing it was you." Nadine smiled faintly. "What did you say I told them you've been dealing with people like Clara since before I was born?" There was a pause. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he added. "You didn't just put her in her place. You're changing the place." Nadine closed her eyes. The words filled her in a way that nothing else had that day. "Thank you, baby," she whispered. "That means more than you know." They talked a while longer, about nothing and everything, about his apartment, his new research fellowship, the professor who still mispronounced his last name. When she hung up, the office was quiet again, but inside her, something had shifted. For years, she had tried to move the needle through strategy, through patience, through diplomacy, but Flight NS-214 had shown her that sometimes the needle didn't need moving. Sometimes it needed breaking off. She stood and walked to the window. The Oslo skyline stood bathed in late morning light. Below her, the people moved on. Planes took off. Flights landed. Lives continued. But somewhere in the air, change had taken flight. And this time, it was flying under her name. By the next morning, the headlines were no longer quiet. Flight attendant removed. Mid-flight. After disrespecting airline executive passenger power move. Shakes North Star leadership black woman. Wrongly accused in first class. She turned out to be the owner. Nadine Langford scrolled through the news articles as she sat in the corner of a quiet cafe near her Oslo office. The clinking of porcelain cups and the low murmur of Norwegian conversations created a soft backdrop to the storm unfolding online. Her face, blurred slightly, was now circulating in newsrooms and social feeds across 3 continents. She took a slow sip of black coffee. The video had been leaked. Only a minute-long clip. But it was enough. It showed Clara's accusatory body language, the raised voice, the denial of service. Then Nadine's calm voice, her declaration of ownership, and the stunned silence that followed. No one could hear every word, but they didn't need to. It was all there in the posture, the tone, the imbalance, and the shift. Comments ranged from disbelief to outrage, from admiration to denial. Some praised her for staying composed. Others questioned why she hadn't spoken up sooner. A few called it a PR stunt. Many recognized it for what it was, a moment of institutional reckoning wrapped in real human tension. Nadine had not authorized the leak, but she wasn't angry. It was already out in the world, and now she had to decide what to do with that momentum. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Caleb Trenton. "We need to meet. Board has concerns. 4 p.m., conference room, C." She closed the message and signaled for the check. As she stepped into the Oslo street, the cold pressed against her sharply, but her expression remained steady. She had been through worse weather. This was only the beginning. Back at North Star's corporate offices, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Whispers grew louder. Screens turned quickly when she passed. Even those who had once smiled politely now nodded more deliberately. People were recalibrating around her, not just because of the title, but because the curtain had been pulled back, and what they saw underneath wasn't what they expected. She walked into conference room C at precisely 3:59. Caleb was already there, along with 2 board members, Celeste Nung, head of international growth, and Martin DeWitt, head of investor relations. Both wore the uneasy smiles of people who had just read too many emails from shareholders. "Nadine," Caleb said, motioning toward a seat. "Thank you for coming. I always show up when things break," she said quietly, sitting down. Martin cleared his throat first. "So, quite a few eyes on us now." "Good," Nadine replied. "It's about time." Celeste leaned in, her tone gentle but cautious. "No one is questioning your right to act, Nadine, but we are fielding concerns. Questions from the press. Calls from equity partners wondering if this was a manufactured crisis." Nadine's eyes narrowed. "Manufactured. Not by you necessarily," Celeste added quickly. "Just whether the internal systems failed in a way that should have been prevented without public escalation." "You're worried about stock price," Nadine said. "Voice even, not systems." Martin shifted uncomfortably. "We're worried about perception." "I don't run this company based on perception," Nadine said. "I run it based on reality. And the reality is, I was humiliated in front of your employees and your customers. If I hadn't stepped in when I did, Clara would still be working your flagship route, treating every black passenger like a stowaway in a designer suit." The silence that followed was thick. Nadine didn't fill it. Finally, Caleb spoke again. "We're not here to contain you. We're here to support you, but we need to do it strategically." Nadine looked at him. "Then start by backing Project Nightingale with full public endorsement. Not just internal memos. I want press briefings, town halls, executive visibility." Celeste hesitated. "That's a lot of exposure." "That's the point," Nadine replied. "You can't correct what you're afraid to admit." Martin scratched something onto a legal pad. "And if shareholders push back, tell them this is what leadership looks like," she said. There was a pause. Then Caleb stood slowly. "I'll draft the official language," he said. "You'll approve before we release." Nadine nodded once. "And I'll do the interview." Celeste's head snapped up. "With whom? New York Times," Nadine said. "Front page, full feature." Martin looked concerned. "Won't that escalate it further?" "It'll elevate it," Nadine corrected. "Because for once, the narrative won't be about a company reacting. It'll be about a woman building something better." She stood, collected her folder, and walked to the door. Just before leaving, she turned back. "You don't have to like how I do this," she said. "You just have to remember that I was the one who could afford to own the airline, even when people like Clara thought I couldn't afford dessert." With that, she stepped out. In the corridor, she exhaled deeply, then checked her phone again. A message from her son. Mom, I know it's getting loud out there. Just remember you don't owe them anything. Say what you need to say. On your terms. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, I will, but I won't just speak. I'll change the volume. She hit send. The following morning, Nadine sat for her interview with the New York Times. The journalist, an older black woman named Alana Breyer, met her at a quiet cafe not far from the harbor. It was early, the city still stretching into itself, the harbor water slick and shining. Alana didn't begin with small talk. Tell me what happened. But more than that, tell me how often it's happened before. Nadine looked at her for a moment, and then she told the truth. Not just about Clara, but about the years of being mistaken for staff. The meetings where her ideas were echoed by louder men. The time she watched flight attendants hand menus to the white passenger beside her and then ask her to wait. She told her about silence, about strategy, about finally reaching a point where dignity demanded a shift from diplomacy to demonstration. And when she finished, Alana didn't ask for clarification. She just nodded. Once? Got it. She said, now let's write something the world won't forget. The article went live at 7:02 a.m. Eastern Time. Within minutes, it had crossed platforms, threaded into conversations, retweeted by thought leaders, and dissected by morning talk shows. The headline was simple but thunderous. She was told. She didn't belong in first class. She owns the Airline. Nadine Langford read the full piece once in silence, seated on the corner of her hotel bed in Oslo. The sun had not fully risen, but the city was already stirring, as was the world around her. She stared at her name in print, her story told not through reactionary scandal, but with agency. Alana Breyer had captured every moment with precision and restraint. There were no embellishments, no fire where there was already heat, just truth. The article didn't vilify Clara by name. North Star's legal department had ensured that, but it painted the full picture. The video, now confirmed to be authentic, had already surpassed 3 million views, and the public was responding. Nadine's inbox had flooded. Voicemails too. Messages from strangers, women, black women, immigrants, airline staff, CEOs, flight attendants, survivors of humiliation, voices who had never spoken publicly, now writing full paragraphs in trembling gratitude. She couldn't respond to them all, but she read everyone. In the conference room later that morning, the atmosphere at North Star headquarters was different. Hushed, but not out of fear. More like reverence. Employees who had once rushed past now paused to offer soft nods, eye contact, even whispered thank yous. One intern, barely 22, passed her in the hallway and simply said, I told my mother about you. That's when Nadine finally felt it. Not fame, not vindication, impact. At the executive roundtable meeting, the energy was uncharacteristically quiet. Caleb stood as Nadine entered and offered her the floor without introduction. She opened her folder, the blue one marked Nightingale, and placed it gently on the table. Then she looked at the faces surrounding her. 10 executives, most of them white, most of them older than her, some skeptical, others newly aware, one or two still rigid, not yet convinced. I didn't come here today to rehash what happened on NS-214, she began. You've seen the video. You've read the article. You've seen the market response. She clicked the remote, and the screen behind her lit up with real-time metrics. Positive sentiment up 64% in 2 days. Recruitment interest increased by 28%. 3 Fortune 500 partners publicly endorsing North Star's reforms. 12 major media outlets requesting follow-up interviews. I'm not showing you these numbers because I care about optics, Nadine continued. I'm showing them because they prove that the truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't destroy a brand. It strengthens it. A few executives shifted, but none interrupted. She paused, letting the silence do some of the work. Project Nightingale is no longer optional. It begins today with executive buy-in, department compliance, and employee protections. You will all receive training. You will all be evaluated. This is not a symbolic shift. It's structural. Celeste Ung nodded, arms folded but eyes approving. Martin DeWitt looked tight-jawed but said nothing. Nadine continued, "There will be discomfort. That's expected. But I am not here to protect comfort. I'm here to protect people." Caleb spoke next. "We've already notified regional directors. The rollout begins in 3 phases. Nadine will oversee each one directly." Martin finally raised a hand. "Forgive the bluntness, but what happens if there's pushback from unions? From senior leadership who don't like being told they need to be retrained?" Nadine met his gaze. Then they'll know what it feels like to be treated like they don't belong. And maybe, just maybe, they'll learn something from it. No one had anything to say after that. The meeting concluded with unanimous approval of the rollout. Later that evening, Nadine walked alone along the edge of the Oslo waterfront. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp. The air carried the scent of salt and clean metal. She passed couples walking hand in hand, cyclists weaving down the path, a child feeding pigeons near the bench where she finally sat. For the first time in days, she wasn't moving from meeting to meeting. She wasn't putting out fires. She wasn't presenting or defending or anticipating. She was simply still. And in that stillness, emotion crept in. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and leaned back, looking up at the soft blue of the evening sky. It had taken years to reach this place. Years of excellence without applause. Years of staying calm while being insulted. Years of letting microaggressions pass because there were bigger goals to reach. But something had changed. Flight NS-214 had become more than an incident. It had become a mirror. Not just for North Star, but for every institution that claimed inclusivity without doing the internal work. And now the world had watched a black woman say no, not with rage, not with scandal, but with a quiet, immovable truth. I own the plane. I belong here. A nearby church bell rang. 6 chimes. Nadine stood and started walking back toward the city center. Her phone buzzed. A message from her son. "They're calling you the woman who grounded the sky." "It's trending, Mom. This is huge." She smiled. "Tell them I didn't ground anything. I made it take off for the first time." She sent the message and looked out over the harbor one last time before heading inside. Back in her hotel suite, she poured herself a glass of water, dimmed the lights, and opened her laptop. A blank document stared back at her. She titled it Polaris Directive Phase 2, because this was not the end. It was only the middle of the beginning. 4 days after the article dropped, Nadine Langford was back at Oslo Gardermoen International Airport, not as an observer, not as a silent traveler, but as herself, whole, seen. She walked with calm purpose through the quiet VIP terminal, dressed in a navy silk blouse and slate gray slacks, suitcase gliding behind her. Her hair was pinned neatly, her expression composed, but her eyes revealed the fatigue of a woman who had not stopped moving since truth cracked open the shell of silence. Flight NS-215, Oslo to Boston, was boarding in less than an hour. Luis Moreno was waiting near the gate, now officially promoted to senior attendant on international routes. He wore a crisp navy blazer, silver pin gleaming on his lapel. When he spotted her, he smiled softly. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Langford." Nadine paused and offered him a quiet nod. "I heard the promotion came through." Louise gave a gentle laugh. "Thanks to you. Or maybe because of you." She shook her head. "You earned it before I ever sat in 1A. All I did was name what was already there." They exchanged a look of mutual respect, the kind that comes not from hierarchy, but from shared clarity. Then he stepped aside and let her board first. The cabin was familiar, but it felt different now. Row 1 was immaculate. A soft throw folded neatly, a glass of still water placed on the tray. A discreet card from the new purser sat tucked into the seat pocket. "We are honored to serve you today. Thank you for shaping the skies." She sat without ceremony and pulled out her journal. For a moment, she simply stared at the page. Then she began to write. "The truth is, I've never liked being visible. I never wanted the spotlight, only the control room. But this time, the room wasn't enough. Silence would have been complicity. And for once, I wasn't willing to play that part." Across the aisle, a middle-aged black woman in seat 1C adjusted her scarf and glanced over. Their eyes met briefly. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. "Are you?" Nadine smiled. "Yes." The woman placed a hand over her heart. "Thank you." No further words were needed. As the rest of the passengers boarded, Nadine leaned back, breathing deeply. She let the gentle hum of the aircraft settle into her bones. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to brace herself. She belonged here. 15 minutes later, the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi. The safety briefing played on the screens, but Nadine's mind was far away, thinking not just about the journey home, but about what waited on the other side. Project Nightingale was live. Phase 1 had already begun in Europe. Phase 2 would roll out in North America by the end of the month. Anonymous culture surveys, equity accountability audits, restorative policy work groups, and most importantly, narrative correction training, a program she had personally overseen, where crew members would be confronted not with punishment, but with stories, real ones, complex ones, unforgettable ones. This wasn't about shaming the offenders. It was about humanizing the harmed. She knew there would be resistance, anonymous complaints, maybe even backlash from certain unions or executives quietly grumbling behind closed doors. But she was no longer interested in maintaining peace at the cost of progress. As the plane lifted off, Nadine closed her eyes. She thought of her parents, of their quiet sacrifice, the way her mother ironed her Sunday dress with trembling hands after working a double shift, the way her father taught her that excellence wasn't just a goal. It was a language one she would need to be fluent in just to be heard. She thought of all the women who had come before her, engineers who were ignored, executives who were misidentified, mothers who were told they were nannies, first-class passengers who were asked to prove it. And she thought of Clara Whitmore. She didn't hate her, not anymore. Pity had no place here, but neither did vengeance. Clara had been a vessel, an amplifier of a frequency that had hummed beneath society for generations. That frequency had finally been intercepted, not silenced, but exposed. You don't heal what you won't confront. At cruising altitude, Louise passed by with a soft smile. "Would you like your usual meal, Dr. Langford?" We kept a record of your preferences." Nadine raised an eyebrow. "I didn't know that was policy." "It wasn't," he replied, "but I made it policy." She laughed quietly and nodded. "Vegetarian risotto. And the citrus water." "Coming right up," he said. She watched him go. The moment simple but powerful. Not because of the service, but because of the memory it contradicted. On NS 214 she had been denied a menu. Today, she was offered one from memory. Halfway through the flight, her phone buzzed with a secure message from Caleb. Subject update on Clara Whitmore. Message final review completed. Termination effective immediately. She requested a chance to speak with you. No pressure. We can decline. Just passing the message along. Nadine stared at the screen for a long time. Speak with her. For what closure? An apology? A public gesture? Or maybe just a woman trying to make sense of how her own bias had brought down her entire career? She clicked the message open, reread it, and typed a reply. Allow it, but not yet. One day, perhaps, but not now. There were still things that needed tending first. She closed her phone and returned to her journal. She wrote about strength, about patience, about the paradox of having to explain your worth even after you've proven it 100 times. She wrote about the little moments, Louis remembering her drink, the stranger in 1C whispering thanks, the card in the seat pocket, the pilot who paused the intercom just to welcome her personally. None of it erased what had happened, but all of it mattered. As the lights dimmed and the cabin quieted, Nadine reclined her seat slightly and looked out the window. The clouds stretched like a soft quilt beneath them, endless and untouched. She whispered something to herself, not a prayer, not a mantra, just a simple line. We don't rise to be seen. We rise to make space for others. And she believed it. Because on this flight, there was no question of belonging, no demand for proof, no interrogation before dignity, just flight, just stillness, just forward. Boston Logan. International shimmered under late afternoon sunlight as flight NS 215 began its descent. From her window in 1A, Nadine Langford could see the curve of the harbor, the outline of the city, the places where she had built a life in between the quiet battles. Her fingers curled lightly around the armrest, not in fear, but in reflection. Louise passed by one last time with a warm smile. We'll be on the ground shortly, Dr. Langford. Thank you, she said. For everything? He paused, then added gently, You changed something for all of us. She didn't respond right away. She just met his eyes and nodded. The kind of nod that carries history behind it. As the aircraft touched down, the cabin hushed in the familiar way it always did when wheels met earth again. There was no applause, just breath, a quiet return. But Nadine knew nothing would be the same. Disembarking was efficient, no fuss, no cameras, not yet. The press had been instructed to wait for the formal event at headquarters. She would have her say, but on her terms. As she walked through the terminal, a few passengers paused to acknowledge her, some with a glance, a few with quiet gratitude in their eyes. One woman clutched her daughter's hand and whispered something to her before nodding at Nadine. The girl smiled shyly. That was enough. At the exit, a black sedan waited. Her driver, Michael, tipped his cap. Welcome home, Dr. Langford. It's good to be home, she said softly. The ride to North Star's headquarters took less than 30 minutes. As the car pulled into the gated lot, Nadine spotted the small but orderly group of employees gathered near the steps. Not for protest, not for spectacle, just to be there, to bear witness. Inside, The executive boardroom was already set. Kolob greeted her at the door with a firm handshake. His tie was slightly crooked. She didn't mention it. "Press conference in an hour," he said. "You ready as I'll ever be," she replied. He hesitated, and Clara Nadine had made her decision on the flight. "I'll speak to her. Privately. After the press leaves." He gave her a solemn nod. "Security will be nearby, if needed." "I won't need them," she said calmly. "But thank you." An hour later, Nadine stood behind the North Star Airways podium in the atrium. Cameras flashed. Reporters jostled. Microphones inched closer. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer and looked up. Then she began. "6 days ago, I boarded a transatlantic flight on my own airline. I didn't wear my title. I didn't announce my credentials. I simply sat in 1A and waited to be treated like any other human being." Her voice was steady, rich with calm. What happened on that flight was not an isolated incident. It was a mirror that reflected not just the bias of one crew member, but the systemic patterns that make those biases feel acceptable. She paused. "For years, I have worked behind the scenes. I believed that leadership meant being quiet, building policy, guiding teams. But I've learned that sometimes silence becomes complicity." The room was silent. Project Nightingale is not a reaction. It is a reformation, a commitment to retraining, rehumanizing, and rebuilding how we see each other in shared spaces, not just in first class, but in every row. She looked directly into the cameras now. "This airline bears my name in more ways than one. It reflects not just my investment, but my principles. And as long as I breathe, it will be a place where dignity is not an upgrade, but a guarantee." The reporters erupted into questions as she stepped back. But Nadine didn't answer. She had said all that needed to be said. The rest was action. Back in her office, she asked for Clara to be brought in. When the door opened, Clara Whitmore stepped in slowly, her uniform gone, her posture uncertain. She looked older than she had a week ago. Or maybe she just looked unguarded. Nadine gestured for her to sit. Clara did. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything yet," Nadine replied. "Just listen." Clara nodded. "You humiliated me, not because you didn't recognize me, but because you assumed that someone like me didn't belong where you were taught authority should live." Clara lowered her eyes. "And you weren't the first," Nadine continued. "I've been doubted, misjudged, undermined, for decades. But on that day, I'd had enough. I understand now," Clara whispered. "No, you don't," Nadine said. Not harshly, but firmly. "But you can. If you do the work—" Clara looked up. "I want to. I don't want to be that person." "Then start by acknowledging what you were," Nadine said. "Not just to me, but to every passenger you ever scanned with suspicion, every voice you ignored, every smile you returned differently, depending on skin tone." "I will," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I swear I will." Nadine studied her for a long moment. "You're not coming back to North Star, but that doesn't mean your journey ends here. What you do with this fall is up to you." Clara stood slowly. "Thank you for not turning this into a public execution." Nadine offered a slight smile. "I don't believe in executions. I believe in exposure." Clara nodded and left the room. Later that night, at home, Nadine sat on her balcony, city lights flickering in the distance. Her son had joined her, handing her a cup of tea before sitting across from her. "You okay?" he asked. She took a sip and thought about it. Yes, she said, I think I am. He grinned. You know, I read somewhere they're calling you the woman who remapped first class. She chuckled. Catchy, but not quite right. What would you call it? Then Nadine looked out at the skyline, her voice low and sure. A reminder. She said, that ownership isn't just about money. It's about memory. It's about knowing who you are, even when no one else does, and refusing to shrink for anyone. He nodded, pride in his eyes. And in that moment, with nothing but warm tea, soft light, and the sound of a city breathing, Nadine Langford finally exhaled, not because the work was done, but because the next flight would never begin in silence again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't retaliate with anger. She simply told the truth. I own this airline. And just like that, a first-class seat became a front-row view into the deep fault lines of racial bias, dignity, and quiet revolution. Dr. Nadine Langford didn't just walk off that flight. She walked into the hearts of millions of passengers who've been mistreated, workers afraid to speak up, and every soul who's been told they didn't belong. But this story isn't just about one woman. It's about all of us. It's a reminder that respect is not a privilege. It's a right. And when stripped of it, some will fall silent, but others will rise. We hope this story moved you, challenged you, and made you feel something deep. If it did, please, like this video, share it with someone who needs a dose of truth, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that expose injustice, uplift hidden strength, and honor the dignity we all deserve. Because the sky should belong to everyone, and we're just getting started.